Yeah. Seems like he's ready for retirement. Okay, folks, I think we're ready. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Edina Housing Redevelopment Authority. It is Thursday, May 19, 2022, about 7:33 in the morning. And before we call the meeting to order, there's a few things that we'd like to cover. Of course, our city is committed to continuing to receive and hear your input on matters. We've been collecting public input through our correspondence web form, voicemail, and our engagement website, bettertogetheredina.org. It's important you know that all comments that have been submitted have been received and read prior to the start of the meeting. You don't need to submit the same feedback in another way. All feedback is considered equally regardless of the way in which it was submitted. This morning there will be 2 times to call in to provide comment via phone. The first is community comment, and the number is the same, whether you're calling in a community comment or in the subsequent public hearing that we're going to be holding this morning. During public comment, of course, recall that you're not allowed to speak on anything that's otherwise on the agenda this morning. If you want to call in for the live public hearing involving the old public works site, feel free to do it, make your comments then. Otherwise, we'll take information from you that doesn't cover anything on today's agenda or a matter that's scheduled for a future public hearing. So on the screen, you can see the numbers. 800-374-0221 is the call-in number. Conference ID 914-5485. And then you give the operator your name and your street address and your telephone number. Press *1 to get into the queue to be able to speak to the HRA commissioners. And then Jennifer Bennerott, our Director of Communications, will introduce you when it's your turn to speak if you're coming into us virtually. And so that, I think, takes care of the preliminary information that folks will need to participate either in community comment or the public hearings coming up this morning. So let's call the meeting to order, and I'll ask Liz Olson, our Administrative Support Specialist, to call the roll.
Commissioner Jackson.
Here.
Commissioner Anderson.
Here.
Commissioner Staunton.
Here.
Commissioner Pierce.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. Next matter before us is the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. And next is the meeting agenda. Is there any commissioner that wishes to modify the agenda anyway, or staff person? All right. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for the HRE meeting this morning?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Jackson moves. Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the agenda for the meeting this morning. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adopting the meeting agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. And now we are back to community comment. That number should come back up on the screen. 800-374-0221, 914-5485. The first thing we'll do, if people are calling in, we'll go to folks that might be here in person that wish to address the council on a matter that's not otherwise on the agenda this morning or scheduled for a future public hearing. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the council on such a matter? Or address the HRA, I should say. All right, hearing nothing and seeing no one coming forward, I'll turn to Director Bennerott to see if we have anybody online.
Good morning. At this time, my operator advises that not only is no one on the line, no one's trying to dial in. There is a brief delay in the broadcast, so I would recommend we wait 1 minute before moving on. My clock shows that it's 7:36, so I'll come back to you when I have a speaker or at 7:37, whichever is first.
Thank you.
I still don't have any callers, and it's 7:37, so I think it's safe for you to move on.
Thank you, Director Benarott. What is typical for either the HRA or when we're sitting as the council is that the city manager, in this case the executive director, would make a response to community comments made in the meeting that was held 2 weeks prior. But I don't think there were any.
There weren't any.
Comments to respond to, so we'll move on past the city manager and executive director's comments to the consent agenda. We've got 3 items on the consent agenda today. Is there any commissioner wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
The motion second to approve the consent agenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor of approving the consent agenda say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. And then we're on to the heart of the meeting. We've got some information to take in this morning, and as part of a public hearing process, we've got 2 matters before us, and Bill Neuendorf has both of these matters. And again, if you want to call in at the end of the presentations, the number, remember, is 800-374-0225, excuse me, 0221. 800-374-0221. Enter the conference ID number 914-5485. So this is in anticipation of potential testimony in these matters that we're going to be taking up now. Manager Neuendorf, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Nice to see everybody this morning. So the item before you this morning is a public hearing regarding 2 resolutions proposing to sell portions of property owned by the HRA. This is a conversation we've been having for about a year, trying to put a new project together to help redevelop that vacant parcel. So the resolutions are 2022-06 and then 07. Today we're not asking for action on those resolutions, but instead want to open it for public comment, for public hearing. We posted this information on the Better Together website about a week and a half ago. That website will continue to remain open for the next week and a half, but we do expect to return at the first meeting in June and then ask for your final decision on these matters. Let's see. So I have a relatively brief presentation that summarizes some of the recent history and recent conversations about the property. This morning, I'm joined in the audience by Dave Anderson at Franchute Companies. Dave and his team has been very helpful to the HRA staff as we've put a lot of these details together, as well as in reaching out to find 2 highly capable and exciting developers to work with for the site. And then also in the room, we're joined by Alex Hall with United Properties Residential. We've talked with Alex before about this site over the last year. And then also in the room, Brent Frederick with Jester Concepts and one of his advisors, Pete Kostrowski with Roku Advisors. We've been chatting with Brent and Pete for 6 to 9 months, somewhere in that time frame, about a potential restaurant on the property. So the existing conditions, as we've discussed over many occasions over the last 10 years, there's a 3.3 acre parcel of land at Edina in Arcadia. It used to host the Edina Public Works facility. That department outgrew the site and moved back in 2013, and the site has been vacant ever since. For the context map, Our Lady of Grace Church is to the south. Jerry's Foods and Hardwares is to the west, the Starbucks is to the north, and then the Hilltop Restaurant is to the east. This is the same sketch and the same concepts we've shared back in January when we walked through the sketch plan process with our Planning Commission and as City Council. So the concept is still the same. We have not yet updated the drawings, but they will be updated. But before we go another round and figure out all the details, we want to make sure that the developers and operators have the property under contract and know what the purchase price is and know what the terms are. So they've been very gracious, and there's been a great spirit of trust and cooperation as we work together so far. But to advance to that next step, they really need these parcels under contract. So the 3.3 acre site is proposed to be subdivided into 3 different lots. Lot number 1 would be on the south, which would become a senior cooperative housing project. Lot number 2 is in the middle. That would become a restaurant with indoor and outdoor dining. And then lot number 3 would be redeveloped as a park space. And the idea being that the restaurant and the park would be open to one another while they would be separately owned and separately operated. There could be that nice free flow from a customer experience and a resident experience of having the restaurant right next to the park. From a bird's eye perspective, this again is the same rendering we shared back in January and February. Multi-story senior cooperative building. The restaurant would also be multi-story, and that's important. We didn't want just a simple little fast food drive-through. That wasn't what we're aiming for. So this restaurant is very ambitious. We're currently looking at a facility that's between 12,000 and 15,000 square feet, set on 3 levels. And part of the reason that the restaurant is multi-story is due to the grade change on the property. We've talked about that quite a bit over the years, but there's about a 35-foot drop from the top of where the Starbucks drive-through is down to the existing grade. And so in order to make up that grade and make it usable, it's very well suited to have a multi-story restaurant. So I'll focus on lot number 1 first, the housing cooperative, and then we'll touch on the restaurant, and then we'll stand for any questions. So United Properties Residential Division is the group we've been talking with. They have the Applewood Point concept, which is a senior housing cooperative. These are limited equity, and they're financed with HUD. So it's once they get their financing, it's a very secure financing source. They've done a number of these types of buildings throughout the metro and frankly throughout the Midwest. It's a model that's been very successful, and they're excited to do one here in Edina. For the real estate terms, we're recommending a purchase price of $3 million. That would be for about 1.7 acres of land. The purchase price might change, though, as we go through the planning process. Sometimes there's some give and take at the Planning Commission and City Council when it comes to the zoning. So if it makes sense and if so directed, if they have to provide fewer than 90 units, we would adjust that sales price to reflect the lesser revenue generated by the project. That the closing of the real estate would happen after the HUD financing is secured. So we're still looking at probably a year, maybe a year and a few months before we actually closed on it. And then there would be no broker fees paid out of that $3 million. So that would be basically there'd be some closing costs, but that's about the price to the HRA. Some of the conditions that we put on that contract is that it's for this deal. It's for this senior co-op, about this size, in about this location. It would follow that limited equity model, and it would also include 10% of the units that are priced to be affordable. That would follow the city's affordability policy. So 90% of the units would be sold at regular market rates, but 10% would be reserved and sold at that lower price. As far as my opinion about the terms, the purchase price is pretty on par for typical senior cooperative projects. We did conduct an appraisal recently that was shared with you in a closed session last month, and the purchase price does meet the appraised value, so we feel that we're in a good place there. One thing to mention, though, is over the years we've talked about many different types of projects: big projects, tall projects, public projects, private projects. As we worked with United Properties, our goal wasn't to cram the most density we possibly could and drive the highest land price. If that was our goal, we probably could have sold it for more money, but we would have put close to twice as many units on the property, and we didn't feel that's what was in the spirit of the Grandview plan for this site. So we intentionally aimed for a more modestly sized and scaled property, but then sell it for the price to match that scale. The contracts are in your packet. I'm not going to walk through them, but they're pretty typical. We worked with Dave Kendall's office at Campbell Knutson. Andrea McDowell-Paler is actually online if there's any questions for her, but she's been working with us for the last couple months putting these terms together. So it's fairly typical contractual terms here. Some earnest money will be deposited after we execute the documents. The unique thing is the due diligence period. In this case, there's 2 phases of due diligence. So kind of a standard 6-month period for zoning. After we execute this, we expect to come back, expect to get the architects to work full steam, then come back late summer, early fall, and go through the rezoning process. After that's complete, and we know what the project looks like and the scale, that's when pre-marketing will happen for the co-op. And that's really vital and something that's different. Usually for apartments, they don't have to pre-sell them because they're just rentals. But for a for-sale housing project, in order to get the loan, they have to have a certain number of units pre-sold or pre-committed. So we're budgeting another 6 months for that to happen. Maybe it happens faster, maybe it takes a little bit longer. So we have typical provisions in the contract to adjust for that time period. But once they hit their pre-sale amount, that's when we would schedule a close. That's when they would lock in their construction schedule, and that's when they would really get to work. We, of course, did build in a safeguard. In case we do close on the property and something goes horribly wrong and the project doesn't get built, the city would have first right to get that property back. So we don't want, this is worst case scenario, but we don't want it sitting vacant for another 10 years. 10 years has been a long time already. And then
you go back through that right of reverter. I mean, what I hear you saying is a little bit different than what I'm thinking reverter means. What I saw in the presentation, the documentation was that we'd have the right of first refusal. So what do we, if we don't get what we want on that property, which is important, do we have the right of, and it doesn't close for some reason, do we have the right to get it back at the without paying an increased cost, or are we in there competing with the market and we have a right of first refusal to purchase it at whatever price they determine they're going to sell it for?
I believe we have both, and the contracts are similar, but they're a little bit different between the restaurant and the housing. So for the housing, there is the right of reverter, where if we close on it and then it doesn't move forward, we could purchase it back for $2.9 million. So basically, we keep about $100,000 for all the hassle, but we would buy it back from the developer and then resecure it. And for the right of first refusal, I honestly don't remember, so I'm going to ask Andrea McDowell-Paler, who's online. I want to make sure that I address the right contract. So,
yes,
Andrea, do we have a right of first refusal on this, or is that just in the restaurant?
I believe that's just in the restaurant. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, so for the housing, it would be the reverter, because once they start building it, it's a for sale product. So eventually you'll have basically like a homeowners association, and we have not made provisions for what might happen if everyone decides to sell in 100 years. But in the restaurant, we did include that type of right of first refusal, because the restaurant might change hands in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but not for the housing.
That you're nodding your head affirmatively, Andrea, is that right?
Correct. Sorry.
You actually muted yourself just now, Andrea.
Sorry. We actually put the right of first refusal and reverter in the restaurant contract, and the reverter is in the senior housing.
Okay. And when does the reverter right apply in the housing contract?
That would apply if they fail to commence construction within the time periods provided.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's see, let me jump to the next screen then. So some of the other terms and conditions in the housing contract.
Now you need to maximize your presentation, and there you go.
So the HRA must commit to build the park. That's important for the developer. If they commit to build the housing, they don't want us to change our mind and build a competitor's product right next door to them. So we need to commit to build the park, which we would do as we go through the zoning process. They also asked that a limitation be placed on the restaurant parcel next door, so that any future building would be no more than 3 stories in height, to preserve some of their views out the northerly windows. In this case, the restaurant is proposed to be 2 stories in a basement, and so we think that's a pretty reasonable limitation to put on it. We've also worked
There's
hard
no
to...
restriction on use, just on height. Is that right?
So United Properties has asked for a restriction on height, but not on use.
Okay.
But the city has asked the restaurant for a restriction on their use. That's in the restaurant contract, but not in the housing contract. And I'll touch on that when we get to the restaurant proposal. Some of the other conditions here in the easements, there's a whole variety of easements. We've worked hard to really maximize the use of the site and the efficiency. So we intentionally created a shared driveway arrangement so that we don't have 4 driveways, we only have 2, and in and out. But that means that the restaurant users would share the same exit as the residential users. That means the residential users might use the same entrance as the driveway as the restaurant users. So that's, we've spent a lot of time working with the architects and engineers on how to make that work, as well as some of the functional things like how do you get the garbage truck to where it needs to be without blocking the entrance to the parking garage for the residents. And so we still have a few more details to work out, but there's those types of easements that we've included in the sales agreement. And then also public easement on the west portion of the property. There's the train tracks. And there's actually, on the train track property, there is about a 10-foot wide easement to the city's benefit for future use. We can't build on it, but we can walk on it, theoretically. There'd be a similar public easement for the 10 feet along the western edge of the site. Right now, that would give us access to the future park in case we have to do maintenance or utilities or things like that. In the future, if the freight train is no longer there and there's a different use, then now there's a public easement back there for some future thing that we don't know what that might be, but it's good to have it. So we've included those types of expectations in the contract. And then switching to the restaurant proposal. So this is
Bill, did we preserve sufficient space for a rail stop?
We feel that we did on the park property or on all the western property. Let me go back to the overhead. So in this image, the train tracks are on the north. So if there is a future transit station, the city does keep about nearly 3/4 of an acre of the land up for the park. We could try to incorporate some kind of rail stop there in the future, but there's no expectation to build a train station as part of the senior building, nor is there an expectation to do that as part of the restaurant building. But we could certainly do something like that in the future in the park space. And also important to remember what you don't see on this map, but everything to the west of the train tracks or just off the top of the screen, the HRA owns all that land. The parking garage, a huge surface parking lot, a public street that's double wide for deliveries. So there's the HRA still controls all that property. And at this point, we feel that's sufficient because a conversion to a passenger system, I mean, it gets talked about from time to time, but at this point, there's no intention on the freight railroad to let go of that property as a freight line. So we feel we have enough of a placeholder if something were to change in the unforeseen future. Before we go on, are there any questions about the housing contract? Maybe this is a good point to take a break on that.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner.
So part of these are going to be at affordable prices. Can you go into a little bit more detail on that? If it's 10%, I assume that's at 50% of AMI. And how is that going to be protected as it goes forward? Because these are partially owned or limited ownership opportunities for people. How do we keep that at an affordable rate over time as ownership changes?
Great question. So I'll try to channel Stephanie Hawkinson, who's been working on that but couldn't join us this morning. So the affordability prices are different than the AMI. So for rental units, you measure by AMI, and you look at a 50 or a 60%. For the affordable units, there's also a comparison to AMI, but it's a much higher threshold. It's like 100 or 120. And I don't know what that is off the top of my head. But every year that price changes as it adjusts with inflation. We're currently at a sales price of about 305, 304?
Per square foot?
No, like for the affordable units.
Oh, the affordable units, yeah.
It's in 320?
20 or so.
Yeah. So it just changed, and they change it every year in the spring. So the affordable units would be sold for about $305,000 to $325,000 in 2022 dollars. The units won't actually be built until 2024, so that price will change. But a typical market rate unit would sell for about...
Well, it may sell for twice that.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on square footage, of course.
Yeah, so Alex Hall is with United Properties, and he, of course, would answer this in the microphone if you wanted. But the typical market unit would sell for the mid-500s to the mid-600s in that range, depending on the size and details of it. So the affordable units would be about half that price. The affordable units would be smaller. They're not going to be the big 3-bedroom with all the bells and whistles. But that's about the initial purchase price, and I'm sorry, can't be more specific today. And then how you keep it affordable is in the limited equity model. So part of how these housing cooperatives work when they're HUD financed is that the growth in value is limited to a certain percentage, and that protects the whole association and its operating costs. So whether you buy in at $500,000 or $300,000, your value, your ownership equity is only going to increase by a couple percent every year. So that way the value of every unit will be preserved and protected in some way, and that's how we'll preserve the affordable units.
If I may, but that's a restriction on the price of the units. How do we make sure that we're getting people who are at a certain percent of AMI to be the people who are buying it? Because there are lots of people who buy housing less than they can afford. And that's their choice, of course. But we're trying to get some opportunities for people who can't afford the more expensive units. How is that restricted?
Yeah, great question. So it's a question we have not yet found the perfect answer to. The initial buyer is easier to get, but actually right before Stephanie went out of town, we were talking with Dave Kendall and looking at other examples in other cities, how they reach the second buyer or the third buyer. We don't have that figured out yet, but as we get through the zoning process and actually start putting like legal restrictions on the property, that's the time that we'll have to figure out if that's possible, if it's legal, and then how to do it effectively. So that's on our radar, but we don't have the wording figured out at this point.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that can be addressed through the zoning process, doesn't need to be as part of this contract or the deed, that can be handled in a different way.
That's correct.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Anderson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Is it possible, the applicant is here, correct? Is it possible to direct some questions to the applicant?
Sure. Sure.
They're a little more technical, and I don't want to put you on the spot, to be honest.
Mr. Hall, would you come up, please?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi. Okay, so I have a couple or three questions. And based on your experience, what's an accurate assessment of your pre-sale requirement timeline? You've got 180 days, and we're in a little tricky spot here economically, and I'm just kind of wondering if you've done an analysis of that.
Yeah, it would, typically we're looking at about 8 months in what I would call a normal market. And so much of what we don't know is construction pricing has been very unpredictable over the past year. And so where that pricing, if the pricing certainly has an impact on demand, so we're not sure. I guess what we're hoping for is a little stability in the construction market, which should help. But we're definitely bouncing back from kind of the post-COVID where we saw a dip and certainly going beyond that 8-month period for pre-marketing. But kind of how we're viewing this is we've got the 180-day initial period, and then we have the other 180-day for marketing. But what we'd like to do is start marketing the product within that initial 180 days, so we're able to take that back in 6 months as well as a couple months of this initial 180 days to reach that period. So, and I would say that also what we've found is some of our cooperatives that are outside of the direct metro area may take an additional 3-4 months to market, but the co-ops that tend to be, cooperatives in Eden Prairie, Minnetonka, certainly Edina, there's a much higher, there's higher density and higher demand. So I anticipate really a lot of interest in this location in Edina, which should help compress that marketing period.
I would expect the same thing. Are we
Knock on wood.
comfortable with the extension period so that we know we can get this pre-sale requirement met? Well, is that, it's referenced in your presentation, but it just kind of, we have one. Do we know, are you comfortable with it?
I'm comfortable with it, and I'm comfortable with the relationship that we have here in that, if we have that, let's say 90-day extension period to the marketing period, if we were short the 60% pre-sale, we enact the 90-day extension. I'm comfortable with the relationship that if we're 5 units shy or 4 units shy, both parties have invested a lot of time into that and coming to the city saying, boy, can we get another 30 days here that we'd be able to do that. But I'm comfortable with the extension periods we have in place right now.
Good, thank you. Now you have Ebenezer for day-to-day as you get in. Is that
We're
accurate?
not sure yet, so we use Ebenezer and we use Paramark. So we use 2 different management companies. I would say right now Ebenezer, Paramark probably manages 4 or 5 of our 17 or 18 co-ops, and Ebenezer manages the rest of those. So we haven't determined yet who would be initially managing this one.
Okay.
And then,
good
of course,
outfit.
beyond that initial management period, it's up to the cooperative and the board who they want to retain as manager.
Yes, thank you. So to get to Commissioner Jackson's question triggered a thought for me. Because your conveyance is a share of stock in the cooperative corporation. And so it's, my question, a technical question would be, can those shares that are allocated to the affordable units, how many would that be? 9. I guess you'd have 9
Yes.
affordable units. Can those shares be annotated in some way or restricted to be certain that we have the eligibility that Commissioner Jackson's asking about?
Yes.
That can be done.
Yes.
And so that's just something that, good. Okay,
Yep.
good.
And we have done that. So we have 2 cooperatives where we've done that. And so to answer Commissioner Jackson's question on how we do establish that initial price of the unit, and then who can buy is based on AMI. And so we'll work with the city and establish what is that target or maximum AMI then that would be qualified to buy the unit. And then, of course, that gap between affordability and the rest of the units will always remain, because if it's a 2.5% or a 3% appreciation, they'll continue to grow at that rate, but that gap won't close. And we also can put in restrictive language, which we have done. Minnetonka is a great example, in the bylaws, as well as whatever agreement we have with you, that would restrict the co-op from at some point taking those units and trying to convert those to the value of the balance of the units. So we'll work with you on that.
Good, thank you. Last thing, the limited equity concept, that can be amended by the HOA at some point in time. You may start at 2% annual or limited to 2% or 3%, whatever the guideline may be, but they can remove that if they choose at some point. And I just want to be, that's the reason that I ask about annotation of the shares.
Yes. So yes, we can certainly put language in, whether it's in the development agreement, but we can put language in that would restrict their ability to change those affordable units. The other comment there is that they really can't change the increase in equity without HUD's approval. So HUD is looking at this saying, it's very important to us that these units remain desirable. And we're guaranteeing the master mortgage. So if a cooperative came to them and said, geez, we want to remove it, HUD would say no. Now if they came to them and said, look, the appreciation in the last 5 years has been 10%, we're sitting here at 2.5%. Yes, we want to remain desirable, but boy, the gap is getting huge. Can we increase this to 3.5%? Again, HUD has to approve that, and they may look at that and say, well, that's reasonable. So there is a little bit of a governor in place as far as that's concerned.
Okay, thank you. Very thorough answers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Hall. All right, on to the restaurant.
All right, great. So lot number 2 is the center lot. This is about 0.7 acres. And Dave and his group at Franchu in 2021 led an effort where we reached out to about 40 different restaurant groups in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, and the Midwest to look for different types of restaurateurs that could operate the type of restaurant we're looking for here. And of that group, we feel the best one was Jester. Local company, well experienced in the area, and excited about this site and excited about this project. So we've prepared the sales contract for the second lot. Purchase price would be $500,000, $500,000 for about 0.7 acres. Out of that purchase price, we did make an agreement with Franchu last year to reimburse them for their work, so there are some fees that will come out of that. It's a lower value, but it's a smaller property with a whole lot of restrictions on it. So some of the restrictions, we'll add that limitation about 3 stories. If it were ever to get rebuilt or hit by a tornado or whatever, there'd be a 3-story height limit on it. But I think more importantly for this group and for this conversation is that the use of that site would primarily remain a commercial business that's food-oriented, that services the park. So in the future, we don't want it to turn into a drive-through bank or a doctor's office that has no windows. We've heard very clearly from you that you want it to be a restaurant today, tomorrow, and theoretically forever. So we did include some language in the contract that would allow it to remain primarily a food-driven property. We did use some generic language like that, though. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years. Maybe in the future. People don't want a restaurant next to the park, and maybe it turns into more of a coffee shop and some other use or something. So we did use some general language that we could interpret a little bit more readily in future years. But that type of restriction is something that we heard very clearly from you that was mandatory, and I think that's something that Brent and his group have said they can live with. So as far as the purchase price, similar conversation here. We did have the property appraised back in April. We shared that document with you in closed session last month. And the purchase price does meet that appraised value. The value of the appraisal is really driven by the restrictions that the city wants on the property. If we were just selling a 3/4 acre commercial lot, similar story to what I said about the housing project, we could sell it for a higher value. And we could put a drive-through, we could put a medical office, we could do lots of different things. We heard very clearly from you, you wanted a food-driven user to help service the park. And when you put that kind of restriction on it, you lower the value. You've reduced the pool of buyers and operators. So that we talked about that at the last meeting.
Commissioner Pierce has a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you just clarify a little bit? So as I remember the conversation we had, we talked a lot about activation. And the way it's in the presentation, it says it complements the park, but 2 or 3 times you have said it services the park. And I just want to make sure as we go through, perhaps it's in future slides that you can speak to how we can activate, because we have talked about concepts with that restaurant where they may be able to do some type of, I'll call it activation with either folks that are in the park or people visiting the restaurant to get that activity going. So am I remembering that correctly, or?
You are, yes,
Okay.
yes. And just a choice of words, services the park, complements the park. I don't remember the exact word that's in the contract. But the idea is that the restaurant is separately owned and operated. But certainly someone could get something from the restaurant and carry it into the park. You couldn't carry from the park into the restaurant, and you couldn't carry beer out of the restaurant. But the idea is that maybe you go to the restaurant and hang out at the park afterwards. Or maybe you go to the park first, hang out there while you wait for your reservation in the restaurant. There'd be that type of complementary action. We've also had some preliminary discussions about whether or not like a service window into the park might make sense. And at this point, I think it's too early to commit to that. We haven't ruled it out, but at this point with the architectural design, we haven't quite figured out how that would happen and still have the kitchen layout work and make it reasonable to the park users. So over the next 6 months, as we work through that final architectural design of both the park and the restaurant, I think that's when we could better understand to what degree we could actually provide direct service through like a reach and window type of thing to the park. So your recollection of that conversation is correct. Yeah. The final important thing to note is something that Mr. Hall had mentioned, the escalating construction prices. The initial construction price for the restaurant alone has grown by about $1.5 million in the last 6 months. The price for food probably hasn't grown by a commensurate rate, the price that a customer would pay. So one other thing we might have to think about, and we haven't committed, but we also haven't taken it off the table yet, is that if construction costs continue to go where they appear to be going, we might return in a separate meeting and ask for a grant using the city's Spark program, those old unallocated TIF dollars. We could use those to build a new building and a new business. At this point, we'd recommend a grant in the range of about $149,000. That would be we're trying to walk the line with the business subsidy laws, the city's business subsidy policy, and what it might take for the park. So it's too early to commit to that grant, but it's also the right time not to yet take it off the table. So I just wanted to make sure, full disclosure, that that's still something we're talking about. I think we're all hoping and praying that construction costs go down. This project probably won't happen for another 2 years because we had the conversation about zoning time period, pre-sales time period. We probably won't break ground on the restaurant until we break ground on the housing. So it's kind of unknown where pricing is going to go between now and then. But that is something I just wanted to make reference to. Contractual terms, pretty basic. Some earnest money, the same due diligence phase for zoning. And then while the restaurant doesn't need a pre-sales phase, you can't build the restaurant until there's half of the building next door. So they're kind of stuck in that limbo period as well. In the contract for the restaurant, we did include a right of reverter as well as the right of first refusal, and that's where they both happen. So the reverter in concept, if we close on the land, something goes horribly wrong, and Jester doesn't start the construction, we'd have the rights to buy the property back. We lose some time, they lose some money, but at least we get the property back to pick up the pieces and start over. We also did include a right of first refusal, and that's if at some point in the future, if the restaurant sells, the city would have the right to potentially buy it if we wanted to buy a restaurant. It's not an exclusive right, it's simply the first right, and that might be an option we might want to consider at some point down the road. So the terms and conditions here are pretty unique for this kind of deal. There's really nothing too fancy, but it does get complicated, especially with the easements and use restrictions we talked about. So just like for the housing, there's a lot of shared use easements on the restaurant property. Those will actually get written as we go through the zoning and figure out the exact dimensions of everything. But there's that shared driveway, the shared access easement along the railroad tracks. One thing we have included in order to provide a service to the park users, there would be public toilets attached to the face of the restaurant building that would open onto the park, and there would be an easement so that park users could use those facilities. Not 24 hours and maybe not in the minus 10 degree winter months, but for typical park operations, there would be facilities there for the patrons to use without going into the restaurant. They could just do what they needed to do. Also, the expectation that the restaurant participates in the maintenance district. This property is located in the Grandview Maintenance District, so the shared services, the special snow plowing, we don't do a lot in this district at this point, quite honestly, but the expectation is they would pay their fair share to shovel the sidewalks, just like everyone else does. And there'd also be a temporary easement associated with the restaurant. The co-op contractor will probably need to step foot on the restaurant property to build the co-op, and the restaurant contractor will probably need to step on the city park property to build the restaurant. So there'll be some temporary easements through the construction phase, and we've built those expectations into the sales contract. We've talked about them quite a bit. It's just how you build something on a small piece of property. And then the third lot is not something we're selling, but I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of this. So the final piece of this whole puzzle is the park on the northern edge. This would be dedicated as a permanent park space for the city. We've designed it to have a series of terraces to help with that elevation change. We have some flat spaces just for general game playing or hanging out space. Could also be the kind of space where there's an event like a Oktoberfest celebration or maybe a movie in the park or a music in the park. We've been working with Confluence Design to help do those concepts for the park. And we've also had the conversations that some of those spaces in the park might be used for public and private events. Like, for example, the Oktoberfest example, which we've not actually talked about. It's just the best example I could think of. Maybe there's an event at the restaurant. They want to spill over to the park and have pretzels and beer in the park while there's pretzels and beer in the restaurant. Maybe there's a way to work together on that. We've done something similar at Braemar with that outdoor yard there. Maybe we want to consider that here. So as we've gone through these initial concepts for the park, we've tried to think of a variety of different types of ways that space could be used. At this point in time, the construction budget for the park would come out of the sales proceeds that we earn from selling the land. That would pay to build it, but maintenance would fall then to the city park and rec district. We'll also build in some placeholders here for future things. Maybe in the future we want public art. Maybe we want a gazebo. Maybe we want a water feature. We would we'd think about some of those things early on in the design. We don't think we have money in the budget to build everything all at once, but we'd want to set aside some places so if at some point in the future we wanted to do something more, we could. And then the obligations of the HRA and this whole contractual deal, again, we need to make a commitment to build the park. We do that through the zoning process. We need to finish the pedestrian bridge that's currently under construction. And then we'd also have to do some initial site prep. Right now, the housing pad is in pretty good shape, but the restaurant pad, there's no access to it. There's like a 15-foot drop-off, so it would be up to the HRA to bring in some dirt and at least make these pads accessible. So we'd kind of do that rough grading. That would be at our cost, again, coming out of the sales proceeds. And that's something that our engineering department has already anticipated. And as we move forward with the sales contracts and the zoning, we'll bring a contractor on board for the city to do that initial work. So the last point I wanted to make is there's a lot of things that still have to happen in the future. Today we're only talking about a sales contract. But just in the interest of having the whole conversation, we still have to go through zoning, that pre-development work, the pre-sales, the project financing. We're looking at construction expected to start in 2024 with completion in 2026. So this isn't going to be an overnight kind of project, which is important why we get these contracts moving and keep the conversation moving so we can actually finish at some point. So with that, that is quite a bit, probably more than I was intending to say. If you have any further questions, I'd love to open it up. Brent Frederick, Pete Kostrowski are here to answer questions about the restaurant, and then our whole team is here as well to answer any other questions you might have.
Good. Thank you, Manager Nunendorf. Commissioner Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to follow back up on the restaurant side. And so this may be part of an operating agreement or however we deal with this, but I do think it's fairly limiting to have language that says the restaurant space is geared towards just food. Like, that's how I internalize the verbiage. And I think I understand what we're trying to do here. But I do, like, in my mind, I think of like the North Loop where the Loose Wiles building is on Washington, and you've got the Free House on one side, you've got a coffee shop on the other, and in the middle is a courtyard. And you walk through that courtyard and they've got bocce ball going on, they got a bonfire going on. In the wintertime, they have an ice igloo and a sauna that you can go sit in and then sit in the ice igloo. And I think from an activation standpoint, I actually think if we're able to have some language, and again, this could be operating principles, where whoever is operating that space, I think we want them to be able to do things like that, because frankly, it makes the viability of the restaurant, it increases the viability of the restaurant if they're able to do things like that. Mm-hmm. So I just want to make sure, one, that we're not limiting the operator to only be able to do food. And then tangential to that, if you were to tell me, well, James, the Grandview Yard is where we're going to do all that activation, and that's going to run through the Parks Service, that's okay. But then I would ask, whatever we're thinking about doing there, that we do it in concert with the restaurant, so that when we think about activation, it's both of those parcels, not just one. Does that make sense?
It certainly does, and I put the site plan or the concept sketch back up here.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of conversations about an active restaurant, and so as Mr. Frederick has been working with his architect, they ended up pushing the restaurant towards the back. We initially assumed it would be on the front, and they're the experts, and they realized, no, you put it in the back because the front, you need that activation space. So right now there's a little grass, it's just shown as a green grassy spot here in the front, but that's the type of space where they could activate it. I think it's too early to say exactly what that would look like, but I think they've heard that message loud and clear, and it certainly would be our hope and expectation that the park department would work together. But those are great comments, and that's definitely what we're aiming toward.
Commissioner Staunton.
We had talked at one point about having publicly accessible restaurant or restrooms in the restaurant building, kind of off to the side. Is that part of this agreement, or would that be part of the land use?
I think it would be in both. It would appear on the site plan, but we'd have to have some kind of easement right or ownership right or something of
So
that
is
space.
that in the sales agreements, or will it be separate?
It's referenced, there's a one line in the sales contract, but we would have a separate easement document for those when they're built. And then through the zoning process, we still need to figure out exactly where they are and how big they are and those types of things.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Staunton? I would imagine they would be something similar to what we just built at Centennial Lakes to connect to the Centrum building there that are accessible to both sides, actually. The city cares for them. They're on our master security system, so we open and lock them remotely.
Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to mention that I strongly concur with Commissioner Pierce's perspective on activation on the site. I view it more as activation and compelling reasons to be drawn to the site as a gathering place is kind of my view of it. And so I just want to be sure that the operators are aware of that as we go forward, and that is a strong consideration, that we don't leave that conversation as a possibility here, but in fact, to activate the site, there needs to be an offering there that is more than just, say, 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock on any given day. It becomes what draws people during the day there, and then how do they refresh themselves once they get there. So all of that, and I know we've talked about it, and I know you're considering that, but I just wanted to mention it again. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Commissioner Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have to say I'm still a little uncomfortable with this food-oriented language. I don't remember making a decision that it had to be food-oriented, and I'm really excited to have the gesture guys here. Okay, I want to make this perfectly clear. I like this concept, and you've been so good to work with. I really appreciate that. But putting it in the deed is pretty permanent. And if I remember correctly, when this concept came before the Planning Commission, they were not 100% ready to give up the dream of a public building there at some point in time, whether it's an art center, whether it's a pickleball, or I can't think of the brooms and the stones.
Curling?
Curling, thank you. And they still have that dream. And so as we go forward in the land use thing, I think when you get to the Planning Commission, they might have some questions about that. And I think for the value of your deed that you're going to be getting, looking 50 years down the line, maybe we do want a different kind of building there, where it's a bowling alley or a curling thing. And maybe that's the rage 50 years from now. And restaurants are a dime a dozen, and you can't sell them. Now, that's probably not going to happen. But why do we want to put that permanently in the deed when we can do that through land use. So can you explain why food-oriented is going into the deed of this property?
Sure, I'll address the concept, and maybe Andre or Dave want to talk about the function of the deed restriction. So as we've had the closed session conversations, there's been different opinions about how strongly to make that wording. My interpretation from what your direction has been in closed session has been that having a permanent food use as part of that property was an essential part of the agreement. Didn't have to be exclusively food. So I think the language we used softened it up a little bit. So maybe it's no longer a full service restaurant. Maybe it's a coffee shop with a doctor's office next to it or something different. So we did try to soften that language. We can look at that a little bit closer and see if there's a better way to make that wording. We want to try to walk that line of protecting the city's interest and our dreams and hopes for that site, but also to deliver a piece of land that is sellable and that doesn't hinder the operator's prosperity or prospects if they need to sell at some point. So we're trying to find that balance. Maybe we haven't found it yet, but we can make some tweaks there.
Well, I have to say the idea of a doctor's office with a coffee shop is chilling. Okay, my blood kind of runs cold when you say that. That's not what I had in mind. I want this to be a mutually beneficial agreement. Okay, so, and you guys might have a weigh in about what you feel about the deed. We want you to be buying something that you really want, and not unnecessarily tie your hands. But by the same token, I think having a doctor's office with a coffee shop is the absolute opposite of what we're looking for here. And so, food is the activation at this time, and then there are things that are associated with that. But are we tying our hands where curling can never be the activation, or a bowling alley, or an art gallery? Those are kind of things that draw people in, but they're not food oriented. And that's my concern, is that as the city grows and changes over time, we don't want to limit that possibility. And maybe food always has to be offered there, but I don't want a doctor's office with a coffee shop. That's not where I'm going with this. And I think that was the agreement that we came to, is we want something that's going to activate the site. Food is good because we can work with that. It's a known quantity. But I guess I just don't want to be, I want to maximize the value for everybody. And so if you guys have an opinion on the deed, or you do want to weigh in, I would welcome your thoughts on that as well, if you have an opinion one way or another.
Thanks again for having us today. I think we're really bought into the space and the community, and we believe in it. So we were willing to make concessions for it to be a restaurant forever and always. That's our intention for as long as we own it. My advisors and council have said that it would be limiting later on, 10, 20 years, if we can't sell it as a restaurant, then it could put us in a tough position. So I think we did make some comments back on the purchase agreement, including your exact sentiments. So we're kind of on the same page a little bit. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
We do expect to make some tweaks in that paragraph. We just got comments back from Brent's attorney this morning, so we were waiting for those. So you will see a couple tweaks to that particular paragraph, and we're happy to, of course, work with Dave Kendall and Andrea Paler on this.
Okay, well, I think we are on the same page as far as the use and the future of the property, but I think I agree with you, and if we can get that reflected in the language, like I said, I don't want a doctor's office with a coffee shop, but something that does, and I would love to hear from my fellow commissioners what they think about that. So that's where I'm at, though. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's on my list too, is the deed restrictions. I mean, to me, that's slippery slope, thin ice, call it whatever you want. I don't generally like the idea of it I like the idea of us having a prior approval on a subsequent purchaser, at least to bind this entity. We already got the right of first refusal baked into the contract, and so if we add the belt and suspenders approach of being able to approve a subsequent purchaser, whether it's us or somebody else, you get away from that problem of limiting it to somebody who's going to come in and have a primary use selling food. And then you give yourself more flexibility to what you're talking about. But I think there are real estate lawyers that do this on a regular basis, so they should be able to help us figure out how to weave our way through this problem and make it work for you. But once you're gone, you don't really care what happens there. We do.
I live here too, but yeah, I do
Yeah.
here. But yes, I get what you're saying.
Thank you for that.
Mr. Chair,
The other thing I'm concerned, go ahead.
I would just comment at the direction of staff, the concern on our end was there was direction from the HRA that some kind of food use was important for coordination with the park use. And I don't think this restriction limits anything else along the lines of bocce or bowling or curling or anything else. All those things could certainly still be part of the use. The concern on our end was it seemed pretty clear the HRA wanted some type of food use there, and if it's sold with no restrictions at all, the buyer could turn around relatively quickly and do something completely different there that really doesn't coordinate with the park use. So that was the basis for the language, and we can certainly revise the language, but that was the underlying thinking.
We got some time to take a look at that.
I think that's it. So I just want to be clear. We want the restaurant.
No.
I think we're kind of conflating a couple of issues with this agreement. If we have the restaurant and it's activated the way we want it to be, and we're able to draw people in, that's great. And if we can do that for the next 50 years, awesome. But if it only works for 5 years and then we have to move to something different, we then want to be sure that we can protect the future use of it as well. And so I think the way you just described that is the way I heard the conversation. I just don't know if the language represents that or not. And that's where my comments were coming from.
I think all of us are trying to achieve that downstream flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Mr.
some
Chair,
subsequent council has
if I may.
the ability to decide what's a good use there. Maybe it's primarily food, maybe food as an adjunct.
Here's your real estate
Yeah.
lawyer.
Mr. Chair, I think Ms. McDowell-Paylor maybe wants to make a comment.
Yes, just a couple of things that I just want to clarify. My concern about the right of first refusal, relying just on that, is that that would require the HRA to purchase the property. And if they don't purchase the property, you then have no control over what it is sold for. Zoning might allow a variety of things to go on that property that you might not necessarily want. And the deed restriction as it's drafted does allow a change in use with the express consent of the HRA. So if down the line they want to do something there that's not primarily food service, you would have the ability to authorize that use.
All right. Well, you've heard the issue, Andrea. I think you've heard the conversation, I should say. And we'll be interested in seeing what, if you modify what you think the language ought to look like based on the conversation this morning. A couple other things I wanted to cover was this, we talked about this activation issue. I didn't hear you talk about cross easements between the park and the restaurant. Anybody can obviously that's at the restaurant walk into a public park, but I'm more concerned about people from the public park walking on the private property. And we wanted to have that be seamless. Council member Commissioner Staunton's notion that this is a service in a park, a restaurant in a park. And so I want to make sure that people can move freely back and forth between the park and the restaurant property.
And I think we've heard that request. I think some of that will get clarified as we go through the final site design. Right now, the image I have on the screen shows how the restaurant is, kind of on one side of the sidewalk and the park on the other side. There is about a 12-foot grade change between the park surface and the restaurant surface. So we're still trying to figure out how that edge happens. We've tried to soften it on the front end, but then on the back end it's kind of hard. But we've definitely heard that request, and Brent might have a...
Yeah, if I may, our design intent is to allow for that. I don't know if you could see it on here, but we want to create a set of walkways throughout the outdoor kind of patio. There's a centerpiece in between the two kind of outside kind of table seatings, almost like a walkway. I think anyone can walk through and then come around and walk all the way around our space. So that's our intent as well. So.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Frederick. And then tell us under what circumstances would earnest money not be returned to either the housing co-op or to United or to Adjuster?
Good question. Andrea, do you want to talk through that?
Yes, so the earnest money would not be returned fully if the senior co-op was not able to make its pre-sale requirements, then only 25% would be returned. If they went through all of their due diligence period and we were ready to go and they didn't perform, then the earnest money would not be returned. The same is true for the restaurant housing. So once we get to the due diligence period and they're comfortable with everything and they're ready to go, if they fail to perform, then the earnest money would not be returned.
Okay. All right. The reason I asked that question was because I feel like the amount of earnest money is fairly modest, frankly, on a $3 million purchase. To have a $50,000 earnest money amount, I think is a little bit light. But if there are circumstances under which it would not be returned, that could affect my thinking on that. And what was it on the restaurant? 20,000 on the $300,000. Or on a $500,000 purchase. That may be normal in the market, Yeah, I think they're both light, but you guys are doing the negotiating for us. We're not doing it direct. So.
And part of the reason we accepted that amount was some uncertainty about rezoning the site, and then also just the time lag. So, I think the restaurant is the best example. They can't start construction for at least 2, maybe 3 years. And so to sit on a big chunk of money that is, they don't even know if they'll close, we took that into consideration when we sized that earnest amount. But we felt it was more important to focus on the use restrictions and the end product than the earnest money.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got folks, I'm sure that, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but there may be potential testifiers here, and so I think we could, if commissioners don't have any other questions right now, we could open this matter up for, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I would love to address the activation piece.
All right, thanks, Mr. Frederick.
Okay, I know it's kind of been a comment that everyone's kind of brought up. We have talked about activation quite a bit. We haven't really decided on is it city's responsibility, is it ours? We're fine with either one. I think we want to activate our space regardless. Can we activate the park space as well? I would say yes. I think there would be some things we would need if it's not just food and you want beverage, an off-sale liquor license or an extended kind of liquor license area to go into the park would be something that we would need to activate it a little bit. a little bit better. So there just could be some conversations to be had for that, but we absolutely intend on activating that park and doing big festivals. I mean, whether it's good for the community and good for our business, I think they're both, and we're kind of lockstep there. So we're excited to complete the activation for the space.
Keep thinking of good ideas. We like the way you're thinking.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frederick. And Mr. Kostrowski, it's nice to have you with us this morning, too. All right, let's open this up for public testimony. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to testify regarding this matter? Hearing nothing and seeing no one coming forward, I'll turn now to Director Benarott and remind folks that the call-in number is 800-374-0221. Conference ID number is on the screen. Give the operator your name, your street address, and your telephone number. Press star 1 on your telephone keypad when you want to speak, and then Director Benarott will bring you in to speak to the HRA. Director Benarott?
I do not have any callers at this time. My clock shows that it's 8:48. I will come back to you at 8:49 or when I have a caller, whichever is first.
All right. For folks that might be listening in, you heard this information conveyed to you in a single sort of presentation. The single presentation from Bill Neuendorf is meant to cover both of the matters that we are addressing for public hearing. So feel free to call in about either or both, the housing cooperative matter or the restaurant that we discussed. We're going to handle them. Mr. Kendall, as we wait here, can we handle these in a single motion in terms of closing it? Or would you prefer there be separate motions for each resolution?
I think separate motions would be best, Mr. Chair.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have someone who's joined the call. As a reminder, if you'd like to testify, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. That will get you in the queue to speak. Again, that's star 1 on your telephone keypad. With that, I have our first caller. Operator, please unmute the line of Ms. Lori Grotz. And Ms. Grotz, please begin by stating your full name and address for the record.
Yes, Lori Grotz, 5513 Park Place. I have comment, please, on both of the projects. Regarding the cooperative, I'm not understanding why the HRA wants to limit the amount of density on that project. There are not single-family homes in the area, so it is a perfect area for density. I think that the project should be, instead of 90 units, it should be a minimum of 180 units. To take into comparison, if you take a look at 7500 York, that project over there, if I remember correctly, is about 337 units. They have a waiting list that goes out years. I think that there should be more units here. You build more units, you get more money for the land. Now, over the previous several years, taxpayers have been led to believe that the HRA would be getting about $11 million for this property. All of a sudden, we're seeing the value dropping down to $3.5 million. This is not fair to the taxpayers. You increase the density, you increase the price for the property, you increase the height on it there. Also, on the units, over at 7500 York, the longest wait is for the larger units, for the 2-bedroom and the 3-bedroom units. There is no waiting for the smallest units at one bedroom at 775 square feet. As far as the restaurant next door, you build that co-op taller, you let the restaurant go higher, and let them have, the way I was thinking, let them have recreation on the upper floors so that there can be something going on the inside in the winter time. Now, for the price, $500,000, I think that's a joke. We're talking 0.72 acres. Now, anybody that lives in Edina and they've gotten their valuation for next year, they're going to think this is a joke. I live in what's considered a tear down, and my property is not even 0.2 acres, and the city has me assessed at over $700,000, and that's for a tear down. If you take a look at the hilltop across the street, if you take a look at the Hennepin County property taxes, the hilltop has 2 property tax IDs. One is for a parking lot, one is for their some land and for the restaurant. Now, the city has that valued all on land, and between the largest portion is 0.57 acres. The smaller one for the parking lot is 0.23 acres, so that's 0.8 acres, which is about 10% larger than what is across the street. And the city's got them assessed on the land portion at about $1.6 million, and you're talking $500,000 across the street. And the food that they're talking about to go in there is pizza and cocktails. Hey,
Ms.
that's
Groats, I need
nothing
that.
really
Ms. Groats,
special.
Ms. Groats, you're well beyond the 3-minute mark. I appreciate your.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor, but what I was hoping was for another minute or so, because on the agenda they show it as 2 separate public hearings, and
Ms.
so
Groats,
then
no, I'm
technically
not gonna-
somebody calling in.
Ms. Groats, you're well beyond
But
the
then I
4
should be entitled.
Ms. Groats, you're well beyond the 4-minute mark. Would you please put your supplemental testimony in writing and send it in? We're going to keep this matter open for further public input until Monday at noon, May 23rd. So I think we can supplement your testimony that way.
Well, just one quick point, please. The city isn't really even getting $500,000 on the property because they're talking about spending $1 million to level out and create a buildable pad for it. And I don't think that this is fair to the taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have no other callers, sir.
All right. We've got 2 matters to consider today. One's Resolution 2022-06, which refers to the or relates to the housing cooperative. Is there a motion to close the public hearing at noon on Monday, May 23rd, 2022, and to continue the action on HRA Resolution 2022-06 to the June 2nd, 2022 HRA meeting?
So moved.
Second.
We got a motion by Commissioner Staunton, second by Commissioner Jackson. To the motion as stated. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adopting the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Next is the matter, Resolution 2022-07, which is a potential contract for private development and sale of property to Jester Concepts. Is there a motion to close the public hearing at noon on Monday, May 23rd, 2022, and continue the action on HRA Resolution 2022-07 to our June 2nd, 2022 HRA meeting?
So moved.
Member Anderson moves, Member Staunton seconds, Commissioner Anderson, Commissioner Staunton seconds. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the motion as stated say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Manager Neal, any comments? Executive Director, as Executive Director?
No comments.
Okay. HRA Commissioner comments? Anything for the good of the order? Commissioner Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The thing I wanted to mention this morning, because we have been talking about the Grandview redevelopment district and potential in the future as well, I think everyone has noticed what's happened out here with the reconstruction along Eden Avenue, which also has closed the south side access from Eden onto 100. I had 2 days ago, I had several phone calls, and these were basically from people stuck in traffic, and they were loud and conversations, which I understand. People get angry when they're stuck. I spoke yesterday with Director Milner, and he did get MnDOT out to reprogram the lights out here. I don't know if that broke it up much. I also touched base with Chief Milburn in the event that there needed to be any consideration given to traffic direction to try to break that up a little bit. What comes to mind for me is, because it's my understanding, and I'm open to correction if my understanding is not correct, but it's my understanding that at some point in time we anticipate closing that south side ramp from Eden to 100. But I note that much of the backup that we have out here is due to not being able to access that. When I take a look at the Grandview district and its potential for redevelopment, and I take a look at two sites in particular, given the land use options that we have seen come forward and have been approved, I anticipate that there will be further proposals there. And I think that the reason I mention this is because traffic congestion and the backup and the ability to get around is truly a quality of life issue. And this is the time to begin to plan for that and to take a look at the overall district and see how is this going to work going forward. And one thing that we could do would be to ask for a comprehensive traffic count or potential traffic count based on what the comp plan would allow for redevelopment in that area, so that we have some guidelines, some thought going forward as to how that can be managed better. So I wanted to bring that out. We have the Vernon Avenue Bridge project coming. We have construction in that area coming, and all of that leads me to believe that even when Eden is open, if in the future that ramp were to be closed, we would have some difficulty there. I just wanted to bring that out today. Mm-hmm. So because here we are, we're talking about Grandview, and we're a block away from it. Thank you.
Good point. How long are we going to have this road closure out here?
Well, there'll actually be a series of road closures, right? So the road closure that we're experiencing now is due to the projects on the other side, on the west side of 100.
Right.
That will last, into the fall, late into the fall, we suspect. But then there will be this other series of projects on this side related to the Reuter-Walton project, the dual roundabouts. That will necessitate some closure and detour as well. I don't have a time frame for that right now. And the Vernon Avenue Bridge as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think we're all going to be getting calls. Thanks for taking them.
Just answer the phone.
Yeah. Did you want to put your number on the screen?
Sure, put it up there.
All right. Anything further? All right. Is there a motion to adjourn the HRA meeting?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves adjournment.
Second.
Commissioner Pierce seconds. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adjourning the HRA meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. The HRA meeting for Thursday, 22 is adjourned.